I apologize. We're recording our separate sessions, so everybody will be able to access these after. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote presentation today. Our speakers today, we're talking about the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee learnings on intimate partner homicide in older adults, trends, themes, and the Ryan and Ryan inquest. Our speakers today, just to give you a brief summary, I know many of you probably have already read their bios. So Dr. Elizabeth Urbanski is currently the Regional Supervising Coroner for West Region, London office, and has served as the co-chair for the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee since February 2024. Prior to this, she was the acting medical officer of health of the Brant County Health Unit and led its response to the COVID-19 pandemic. A graduate of the University of Toronto, she completed her residency in family practice and emergency medicine at the University of British Columbia. Most recently, she completed her Master's of Public Health at the University of Waterloo. And prior to transition to public health, Dr. Urbanski practiced emergency medicine at Woodstock Hospital, where she was also the chief of emergency. She has been an investigating coroner for over 20 years and has presided over numerous inquests. Accompanying her is Indira Stewart, who is an inquest counsel at the Inquest unit at the Office of the Chief Coroner, where she represents the public, leading inquests aiming at examining systemic issues in death prevention in Ontario. She provides general legal support for the Chief Coroner and the Chief Forensic Pathologist of Ontario on a wide range of issues, including deaths related to intimate partner violence. She's also served as the co-chair for the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee since 2024. And lastly, but not least, we also have Hannah O'Brien. Hannah is the Senior Policy and Program Advisor in the Office of the Chief Coroner, where she supports the development of policies and procedures and service delivery enhancements within the OCC, and has served as the executive lead of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee since March 2023. As the executive lead, Hannah identifies cases for review, prepares committee reports, and provides operational support to the committee. So I would like to welcome you all to our conference today, and I will turn it over to Hannah to share her screen to start her presentation. Thank you.
While Hannah's pulling up the slides, I want to thank Ryan and the whole organizing committee and for inviting us here. It sounds like it's going to be a great day for all the participants. So as mentioned, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Urbanski. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee of the Office of the Chief Coroner. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off the presentation, and I'll give a brief overview of the Office of the Chief Coroner for Ontario, and especially in light of many participants coming from across the country, as death investigation systems will vary from province to province. And then we'll go into a bit of the mandate, mission, and scope of the DVDRC, some findings and trends and recommendations over the years, and then specifically into intimate partner homicide and aging populations. And this was a chapter in our 2022-2023 annual report. Indra will speak specifically over the Ryan and Ryan inquest, and then time for discussion at the end. Once again, a bit of content warning. This presentation does include discussion in regards to homicide, suicide, and intimate partner violence and abuse. So it may be difficult for some audiences. There is a link to mental health supports, and there was also resources given earlier in the presentation. Just a brief overview of the Office of a Chief Coroner for Ontario. We are obviously a coroner-based system, a death investigation system, and in Ontario, to be a coroner, you must be a licensed physician. So that varies. I think there's only one other province that is set up similarly, and that would be Prince Edward Island. So in Ontario, all non-natural deaths must be investigated, but we also do investigate natural deaths, specifically under certain environments or circumstances. Some of these include in custody deaths, pregnancy-related deaths, if a person was being held in a correctional or psychiatric facility, um, uh, group homes, and also police custody. If a child has or youth has been in the care of a Children's Aid Society within the last year, these deaths must also be reviewed, no matter the cause of death. Next. So a little bit of an overview of the statistics. As you can see, just under 120,000 deaths occurred in Ontario in 2024. And the coroner's office of the chief coroner investigated about 16% of these deaths. Natural deaths still make up a significant proportion of the deaths we investigate. But as you can see, accidents are pretty similar. Then suicides, what we would call undetermined. So we are not able to choose a manner of death or there's competing manners between, say, accident or suicide, accident or homicide. Just close to 300 homicides, and then some of the cases haven't been finalized yet, and that's why you see this 158 that have not been yet determined. What do we, as a coroner, we have to answer what we call the 5 questions: who the deceased was, when did they die, where did they die, how did they die, and what was the manner of death? And you can see the manners of death listed there. But just as important, and probably more important, is our public interest or preventative mandate. And there's 2 things that we have to do under that, and is first determine whether an inquest is necessary or not. And we'll have a little bit more on inquests in general just before the presentation on the Ryan and Ryan inquest. And then to make recommendations to prevent further deaths. An individual coroner can actually make recommendations to parties involved that may make an impact to parties, but also there's different mechanisms for this through the Office of Chief Coroner. Next slide. And one of these is the death review committees, and these are set up for cases involving more specialized areas that may benefit from expert assessment or advice. And as you can see, we've got several at the Office of Chief Coroner. Most are more medically orientated, such as the Pediatric Death Review Committee, Obstetrics and Perinatal Patient Safety. But also you can see we have one committee specifically for geriatric and long-term care, the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee, and our newest committee, the Construction Death Review Committee. So the DVD was established in 2002 in response to recommendations that arose from 2 major inquests into the domestic homicides of Arlene May and Gillian Hadley by their former male partners. And its mandate is to assist the chief coroner in the review of domestic violence-related deaths after initial investigation has been completed by the coroner, and once again, to make recommendations to help prevent further deaths. Next. And so we really aim to aid in the elimination of domestic violence-related deaths in Ontario and promote increased attention and accountability in the consideration and implementation of recommendations. And that's done through leading the analysis of domestic violence related deaths in Ontario to better understand why such deaths occur, and trying to create further systemic change through comprehensive case analysis, developing transformative recommendations, and the public dissemination of the committee's reports. It is a multidisciplinary advisory committee, and it consists of representatives with expertise in domestic violence across different organizations, environments, and capacities. We, for example, have leaders from the shelter system, from White Ribbon, from the Ontario Police College. So we're looking for that broad range of experts to sit on and give inclusive, diverse perspectives. In total, we have currently 14 members, as well as the two co-chairs, myself and Indra. Hannah is the executive lead, and we also have a program administrator and police liaison to assist us. Next. And this slide just shows sort of a bit of an org chart where we sit in. We sit under the Ministry of Solicitor General in Ontario, under the Office of the Chief Coroner. So, as mentioned, we conduct confidential multidisciplinary reviews of domestic violence deaths to support the Chief Coroner's investigations into such death. And this is done under the Ontario Coroners Act. Looking to identify the presence of potential systemic issues, problems, gaps, or shortcomings in the cases. And then also to take that overall view, identifying trends, risk factors, and patterns from the cases reviewed. Then proceed to make recommendations arising out of the circumstances of the deaths to prevent further deaths and encourage effective intervention. We report annually to the office, to the Chief Coroner on the committee's work. So what is our scope? So there was a bit of a renewal of the scope in 2022, 2023. So we will review a death if the violence or abuse by a person's current or former intimate dating or sexual partner, or violence or abuse by someone who has had or expressed a sexual or romantic interest in the person. And if this violence is likely contributed to the death of the person or an associated person. So just a little bit about more. It's fairly straightforward with the current and former or former intimate partner. But also we've had cases where there's been this perceived relationship. So as you know, as society is changing, so perceptions of relationships and different relationships have evolved. So this has been included to really take in the breadth of intimate partner violence. An associated person, unfortunately, we have had cases where children in the relationship or children of the target have been killed instead of the target. So even if it wasn't the two intimate partners, but an associated person was killed, then we would look at this, review the death. And just, likely contributed to the deaths mean intimate partner violence or abuse was at least somewhat of a factor in the death. What's outside? These reviews are done based on available documented information. They are not reopened. So the quality of the review is dependent on the quality of the information provided. We do not gather additional information or speak to witnesses or the family. And our reviews happen after the fact. And in fact, some of our reviews occur many years after the incident because we cannot review the case if it's currently going through the criminal justice system. So Often we're reviewing cases 5, 6 years down the road because it's gone through the criminal justice system, appeals, etc. We are not allowed to assign blame, responsibility, or make comments on judicial outcome. And this is the same that applies to all coroner's investigations in Ontario and is outlined in our act. So as I mentioned, it is a comprehensive paper-based review of materials, and members look at the history, not only of the victim, but the person believed to cause the death and their relationship, circumstances and conduct of the perpetrators, victims, and the respective families, friends, colleagues. They're looking for community and systemic responses. We have a whole list of risk factors that they go through, both for the victim and the person believed to have caused the death and their relationship, and also look for points of intervention. We look at a wide variety of informations and documentation. A lot do come from police briefs, but we will also obtain documents from victim services, children's aid societies, medical records, clergy. If there's family documents, we have access to counseling, probation records, etc. Once again, looking, was there any possible points for intervention? Also look for immigration or cultural issues, relationship status, firearms registration, access issues involving children, as mentioned, life history of those involved. If there's notes, diaries, electronic messages, insights from others, and once again, looking at the risk factors for intimate partner lethality. And members will take on cases. Sometimes it involves just a homicide victim, or a case would maybe a homicide-suicide situation. They would review it. These are do their initial review and then come back to present to the whole committee for comments, further recommendations, etc. That's then put into, we will send recommendations out to the recipients, and then the cases would be put together into an annual report. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Hannah to carry on the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Liz. As Liz mentioned, my name's Hannah O'Brien. I am the executive lead of the DVDRC here in Ontario at the Office of the Chief Coroner. So, as Liz mentioned, we report annually on the activities of the committee and the deaths that have been reviewed. And one thing that changed recently is kind of the reporting structure. And so, if you haven't already taken a look, we published it in November of this past year. We did a new type of annual report where we actually published themed chapters looking at different deaths based on kind of common themes or issues that were present. And it was broken up into 7 chapters. And this is the first time our committee's ever done something like this, rather than kind of reviewing or just preparing recommendations based on one case. We prepared recommendations based on a particular theme area. And so one of those, which is of particular interest based on today's conference, is our first chapter, which is on intimate partner homicide and aging populations. We also have other chapters that may be of interest to you, including a chapter on firearms, additional one on family law. So this was cases where family law or family court related issues were present in the cases, and relating to maybe access orders. We also had a chapter on mental health and substance use. So these were cases where the individuals involved in the deaths had struggled with different substance use or mental health concerns. And so it was trying to identify opportunities to provide additional supports. We also have a chapter on children in the aftermath of intimate partner homicide. As Liz mentioned, many children are affected by intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide. And we've seen in a lot of our cases reviewed that oftentimes parents who maybe one or both die as a result of intimate partner violence, the children are often left behind. And so this was a chapter that our members thought was very important to discuss. We also have a chapter on immigrant, refugee, and precarious status communities. So looking at kind of the unique vulnerabilities that newcomers to Canada may face in helping, obtaining help in IPV situations. And then we also had kind of we called it like a one-off case where we just had one case in the 2022-2023 review year that involved a 2S LGBTQIA plus couple. But we did kind of a larger analysis looking at previously reviewed cases involving the LGBT community. And so we have this chapter as well. So just to provide a little bit of an overview, this is kind of some of the data that the committee has produced over time. So as Liz mentioned, the committee has been reviewing cases for over 20 years now. And so in our most recent report, we provided kind of an overview of the last 20 years, how many cases we've reviewed, how many deaths, and what kind of the statistics look like. So we've reviewed over 400 cases, 420 to be specific, which has involved over 600 deaths. And that means that some cases involved more than one death. Could be homicide, suicide, or multiple homicides in one instance. And I think what's remarkable here in the kind of macro lens is that 76% of the deaths were homicide victims. 85% of these were female. And one thing that I think is very striking and is pertinent to this discussion is that there is really no age discrimination with intimate partner homicide. You know, we see victims ranging from 5 months old all the way to 91 years old. And sometimes I think we have this perception that IPV really only happens in maybe, young or middle-aged couples. But really it can affect every single person across the lifespan. More than half of the homicide victims in the cases that were reviewed by our committee died as a result of trauma. And what that means is that cuts, stabs, beatings, assault, and that's the majority of the cases that we see. But the next kind of cause of death is by firearm, actually. And this is why we had a chapter on firearms. So 25% of the homicide victims we've reviewed died by firearm, followed by asphyxia. So that's strangulation or choking. And so another kind of interesting statistic is that over 80% of the cases reviewed by the DVDRC, the deaths actually occurred at home on their own property and residence. And I think that just shines a light on kind of the vulnerabilities of intimate partner violence situations and how these can happen in, one of the safest spaces you have, which makes it a very challenging issue. When looking at the risk factors across the DVDRC reviews, I just want to highlight that over the years, the DVDRC has actually developed risk factors based on the deaths that we've reviewed. And there are 41 risk factors for intimate partner homicide. We look at the questions of, were these deaths predictable? Were they preventable? Was intervention possible anywhere? And, what kind of lessons can we learn? And in doing an analysis over 20 years of cases reviewed, it's been identified that 7 or more risk factors were present in 70% of the cases. So a lot of the time, there were signs that, violence was happening and potentially something dangerous could occur. And the number one risk factor that we see in over 75% of the cases, 77% to be exact, is a history of domestic violence. So majority of the time, it's not a surprise that this happens. There is a history, there is some known violence happening. The next most common risk factor that we've seen in our cases is actual or pending separation. We know that this is a very vulnerable time for a lot of couples and individuals when a relationship is breaking down or they're separating. And so we've seen this happen in a lot of cases as well. And one thing that we have highlighted here in our slide is that the perpetrator or person who caused the death has actually threatened to kill the victim in 34% of the cases. And we find this interesting because sometimes in the cases we review, people don't take this threat seriously, but it is quite serious and quite present. One thing that I wanted to talk a little bit more about, just based on the content of today and looking at older adults, is in the last 20 years, out of the 420 cases reviewed by the committee, 76 cases, so 18%, involved adults 55 and older. And this was one of the reasons why we decided to look at IPV and older couples in our annual report most recently published. We chose 55 years as kind of the threshold for looking at older or aging adults, just to be a bit more inclusive. And what I think is really interesting here is that the statistics vary a little bit. Like I showed you in, I'll go back 2 slides. We in macro wise, 76% were homicide victims of our cases. Whereas in the older adults, we kind of have a 50-50 split where it's homicides versus homicides, suicides. These cases account for 121 deaths across the 606 that we've reviewed over the years. And 79 victims were age 55 and older. As you can see here, the bottom left box, 96% of the victims were female and their median age was 65 years old. You can also see a very similar statistic here. We say perpetrators or person who caused the death, 96% were male, and the median age is very similar, 66. We have seen examples where there are female perpetrators, of course, and their median age is a little bit lower at 40. And so we have 4 victims kind of this group where they were age 54 or younger. And as I mentioned, this was really interesting to look at because it prompted us to review aging populations kind of in more depth. And so in 2022 and 2023, our committee looked at 6 cases that involved individuals aged 55 plus. And we're looking at, what kind of unique risk factors are present. These included declining physical and mental health, dementia, or any sort of, memory loss related illness, and social isolation. Here's just a little screenshot of our chapter. And some of the recommendations in this chapter are around the themes of developing tailored risk assessments and tools for older adults, providing sector-specific training on aging and IPV, looking at improving information sharing across services, especially since a lot of older or aging couples are involved in a variety of services and sectors. And that kind of lends to enhancing coordination between the healthcare sector, social services, and justice. Also, recommendations surrounded strengthening protective and supportive mechanisms for older adults, which includes addressing ageism in Ontario. And one of the recommendations was about continuing funding organizations that support older adults. And so there were 6 recommendations in this chapter, most of which, I think 5 went to the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility. And 1 went to a few other health and justice partners, including the Solicitor General. So we ask for responses to our recommendations within 6 months' time. And so we have actually gotten some responses back to these recommendations, so I thought I'd highlight them. And these are publicly accessible upon request. So MSAA has reported that many of the recommendations are in progress, are being worked on, or are currently being supported by existing initiatives. So one of the things that they mentioned was their seniors liaison committee, and that they also, as a ministry, provide ongoing financial support to various organizations that work for and advocate for aging adults, such as EAPO. Solgen responded that they are in the process of reviewing and updating their guidelines for a new police guidance manual. which ensures ministry guidance to Ontario Police Services and is in alignment with the Community Safety and Policing Act. They have also said that they are looking to further examine the recommendation with a particular focus on updating any guidance materials and documents related to elder, vulnerable, older adults, including abuse and victims assistance, as well as intimate partner violence, and seeing how this can be incorporated into the DVRM, which is the Domestic Violence Risk Management Report that is used by many police services. So with that, I will pass things over to my colleague, Indira Stewart, who's counsel here in our office, and we'll speak a little bit about inquests.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Indira Stewart, and as Hannah said, I am inquest counsel at the Office of the Chief Coroner. I'm going to be speaking about a 2023 inquest that examined many of the issues that we've been discussing today related to aging populations and intimate partner violence. And that's the inquest into the death of Gladys Helen Ryan and William Thomas Ryan. And I just wanted to give a couple of quick disclaimers because lawyers love disclaimers. First of all, as a government lawyer, I'm supposed to tell you that I'm not speaking on behalf of the Ministry of the Attorney General when I speak about this case. And second, I just wanted to clarify that I was not inquest counsel on the Ryan and Ryan inquest. I was not involved in the inquest in any way. So I have reviewed materials related to the inquest to be able to speak to you about this really important inquest, but I may not be able to answer every question you have about it, but I will certainly do my best. So I wanted to provide you with some background information about what an inquest is and what it's not. And an inquest is a public examination or an airing of the circumstances of a death. And it really speaks to the mission of the Office of the Chief Coroner, which is to ensure that no death of a community member is overlooked, concealed, or ignored. An inquest is a legal proceeding. Rather than a judge, inquests are overseen by a presiding officer who is most often a coroner. So that's a medical doctor like Liz, although sometimes lawyers oversee inquests as well. Each inquest team has an investigator who gathers information under the direction of the presiding officer. And on the team, there's also a lawyer like me who is tasked with determining what evidence will be called at the inquest. And then the lawyer is responsible for calling witnesses to testify at the inquest. And witnesses may include civilians, maybe emergency responders like police or EMS workers. There may be medical staff, doctors, nurses, et cetera. And there are often also experts who testify at inquests. Parties may seek standing at an inquest, and parties are those that have an interest in the inquest. So this may include family members of the deceased person. It may include government ministries. It may include public interest organizations, just as examples. Parties have the right to ask questions of any witness or to make submissions at the inquest. And the inquest evidence is presented to a jury. The jury is made up of 5 members of the public. A really unique feature of inquests is that jury members may ask questions of any inquest witness. And this is different than a civil or a criminal trial where the jury members don't have that right. After hearing all of the evidence as part of their verdict, the inquest jury must answer the 5 questions that Liz referred to earlier. So those questions are who died, where did they die, when did they die, how did they die, and that's the cause of death, and by what means did they die. And as Liz referred to, those are the 5 manners of death: accident, natural, homicide, suicide, undetermined. The inquest jury also may make recommendations. They don't have to, but they may make recommendations aimed at preventing further similar deaths. And like with the DVDRC, recipients of the inquest recommendations are asked to respond to the recommendations within 6 months. Now, these are recommendations. A response is not mandatory, but certainly we do at the Office of the Chief Coroner hope that organizations will respond to our recommendations. In terms of timing, like a review by the DVDRC, an inquest does not begin until all other charges have been dealt with. So, for instance, in the case of an IPV-related homicide, where an accused is criminally charged, the inquest will not occur until after the trial and any potential appeals are complete. So now that's a little bit of information about what an inquest is. And now I'll just briefly note what an inquest is not. Inquests are explicitly not about finding fault or liability or finger pointing. And this is very different than a criminal or a civil proceeding where that's really the goal is to discover who's at fault. Also, inquests are not a general examination of every possible issue related to a specific death. Each inquest has a focused scope, which sets out the parameters of what will and will not be examined. Next slide, please, Hannah. So some inquests are mandatory pursuant to the Coroner's Act, and these include when prisoners die in custody, and when individuals die in the custody of the police or a result of police use of force. So both of these are categories that involve individuals who die sort of in the custody or the care of the state. There are also other mandatory categories for inquests, and these include workers who die in mining-related deaths or the deaths of children with access orders. Those are just a couple of examples. Inquests can also be discretionary, and this means that an inquest may be held at the discretion of the coroner if they determine that an inquest would assist to more accurately answer the 5 questions that I referred to, or if it's seen to be in the public interest to have an open and full hearing of the circumstances of a death. And there's a likelihood that the jury will make useful recommendations to prevent further deaths. So the inquest into the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Ryan is actually an example of both a mandatory and a discretionary inquest, and I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. The case of Mr. and Mrs. Ryan involved the homicide of 77-year-old Gladys Helen Ryan by her 70-year-old husband, and his name was William Thomas Ryan. The couple were each known actually by their middle names, Helen and Tom. The Ryans had been together for 38 years, and they had no children. Each of them struggled with various health conditions, which ultimately led Mr. Ryan requiring a trip to the emergency room on the day of the incident, and that was October 27th, 2017. Unbeknownst to anyone, Mr. Ryan had hidden a gun on his person, and he'd taken it with him to the hospital that day. And while waiting together in the same hospital room, Mr. Ryan shot and killed his wife. Police responded and subsequently shot and killed Mr. Ryan. And I'll tell you sort of more details about the case shortly. I mentioned earlier that this inquest was both a mandatory and a discretionary one. And that was because, so Mr. Ryan's inquest was mandatory because he was killed by the police. And then it was determined that a discretionary inquest was necessary into the death of Mrs. Ryan I told you about the considerations that go into determining whether a discretionary inquest will be held. And then ultimately their 2 deaths were examined together in a joint inquest, which is permitted under Section 25(2) of the Coroner's Act. The inquest into the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Ryan took place in the fall of 2023. Like most inquests, it was held virtually. 17 witnesses testified over the course of about 2 weeks of evidence. And this included expert evidence from Dr. Peter Jaffe. Dr. Jaffe is a psychologist and an expert in IPV, and he was one of the longest standing members of the DVDRC. He just retired from the committee last fall after 20 years of service with the committee. And we miss him terribly. At the inquest, Dr. Jaffe identified various risk factors for intimate partner homicide that were present in the Ryans' relationship. And I'll take you to those in a moment. The inquest jury ultimately made 32 preventative recommendations in relation to the Ryan case. Next slide, please, Hannah. As I mentioned, both Mr. and Mrs. Ryan struggled with various health issues. So Mrs. Ryan suffered from a rare neurodegenerative disorder that resulted in memory loss, reduced motor function, dementia, and seizures. She also had a history of severe and debilitating arthritis, which limited her mobility. As a result of these conditions and other conditions, Mrs. Ryan was extremely dependent on her husband. He was her primary caregiver, and she really didn't have a lot of personal support from family beyond that because she was an only child, and the couple had limited contact with any extended family. Sorry, one moment. Mr. Ryan's health was also precarious. He had severe obesity. He had been treated for prostate cancer in the summer of 2016. He also had severe and chronic knee pain that impacted his mobility and at times required him to use a motorized scooter. Mr. Ryan had been admitted to hospital and then to rehab during the summer of 2017, so just a few months prior to the incident, due to a vertebral fracture. He also struggled with depression. As I noted, Mr. Ryan was his wife's primary caregiver, but he struggled really to take care of his own health and well-being, and he struggled to keep the home sort of in a hygienic condition. As a result of their various medical conditions, the Ryans had received a host of support services from Lynn service provider agencies, and this included PSWs, physiotherapy, and nursing. So they were receiving support from the community. Next slide. Thanks, Hannah. So to give you a bit of additional background about the Ryans and the incident. So for 20 years, the Ryans had spent 6 months of the year living in Texas and 6 months of the year living in Ontario. When they were in Texas, they were well supported. They had a live-in housekeeper and caregiver who helped take care of them. And then they were in Ontario for 6 months, where they lived in trailer parks in Northumberland County. They were actually just finishing up their time at a trailer park in late October when the incident occurred. Their plan was to return to Texas in just a few days when the trailer park where they were living closed for the season. Mr. Ryan had in fact already prepaid his deposit for the return for the 2018 season. The couple were also firearm enthusiasts. They had a very large collection of firearms at their Texas property. And there was some indication from family members that Mr. Ryan had previously threatened Mrs. Ryan with a gun and that he had exhibited controlling behavior, including with respect to their finances. On September 19th, 2017, a situation table was held at the local OPP detachment in relation to Mr. and Mrs. Ryan. Now, many of you may be familiar with situation tables, but essentially they are meetings attended by various community organizations, frontline service providers, and police, where the group discusses and attempts to mitigate the emergency needs of vulnerable persons who are at risk for deterioration or harm. On September 19th, one of these situation tables was held, as I said, and it was determined by a vote of the situation table members that the Ryan situation met the threshold for elevated risk and that there was a need for multi-agency intervention. However, it appears that apart from some brief intervention attempts and a referral from Mr. Ryan to occupational therapy, It was determined that the Ryans were already linked to a number of community supports and that no further steps were necessary. Moving then to the day of the incident. On the day in question, October 27th of 2017, the couple's primary PSW was at their trailer that day and spoke to Mrs. Ryan, and Mrs. Ryan was upset. She told the PSW that Tom was having a hard day and that he was not himself. And she was worried about him. He had expressed suicidal thoughts, and she thought he should be assessed by a doctor. The PSW contacted her supervisor, who advised her to call 911, which she did. And paramedics and OPP officers both attended. And they had various conversations with the Ryans. They were actually at the home for several hours, and they really did take the time and asked a lot of questions. Mr. Ryan initially did not want to attend the hospital. As I said, it took hours before he was eventually convinced to go to hospital, in part because of his low blood pressure. Paramedics also spoke separately to Mrs. Ryan, and she disclosed incidents of verbal and physical abuse and expressed concern for her own safety. So the paramedics first transported Mr. Ryan to hospital. He arrived at about just before 3 p.m. And Mrs. Ryan was then transported later that day because she was disoriented and unable to care for herself. Upon arrival, the paramedics advised the triage nurse and care nurse at the emergency department to keep the couple separated due to Mrs. Ryan's expressed safety concerns. However, once Mr. Ryan was medically cleared, he and Mrs. Ryan were placed in a hospital room together to await transportation to take them home. So unbeknownst to any of the emergency responders, so the police, the EMS, the hospital staff, unbeknownst to any of them, Mr. Ryan had smuggled a firearm into the hospital. So Mr. and Mrs. Ryan, as I said, were placed in this room together, and medical staff heard what sounded like a gunshot. They obviously immediately attended the hospital room and saw Mrs. Ryan bleeding from a very serious head wound. She was rushed to a trauma room, but was unfortunately pronounced deceased. Mr. Ryan initially indicated that she had shot herself. Police attended. Mr. Ryan pointed the gun at the officers, and he was shot by officers and killed. And it was eventually determined that Mr. Ryan had shot his wife, in part because her DNA was not found on the gun. Next slide, please, Hannah. So earlier, Hannah talked about the risk factors for IP homicide that have been developed over many years by the DVDRC. And at the Ryan and Ryan inquest, Dr. Jaffe testified about the numerous risk factors that were present in relation to Mr. and Mrs. Ryan and the various opportunities for intervention that had been there. So the risk factors identified were Mr. Ryan's history of depression, his prior threats to commit suicide, his history of abuse towards Mrs. Ryan, and this was recounted to EMS workers by Mrs. Ryan, but also by some family members who, as I said, noted his controlling behavior towards her. Dr. Jaffe also spoke about both the prior threats, Mr. Ryan's prior threats to kill Mrs. Ryan, and prior threats with a weapon. And this related to reportedly at one point, Mr. Ryan had chased Mrs. Ryan with a gun and had threatened to kill her. Another risk factors present in the Ryan's case was their access to firearms. Both Mr. and Mrs. Ryan were gun enthusiasts. They had a large collections of guns. Mr. Ryan reportedly traveled with a gun in his vehicle. Mrs. Ryan had a gun in her purse. This was widely known. And Hannah noted that there was a separate chapter in our 2022-2023 recent annual report regarding the link between firearms and IP homicide. A further risk factor was Mrs. Ryan's intuitive sense of fear, as recounted to the EMS workers. And then the victim vulnerability. I noted that due to her health issues, Mrs. Ryan was really very dependent on her husband. He was her primary caregiver. Additionally, if we look at the themes that emerged from the aging populations chapter of the DVDRC's most recent report that Hannah talked about, some of those were also present in this case. So we had the declining physical, mental, and cognitive health of both of the Ryans, Mrs. Ryan's memory loss, and the couple's social isolation. The jury in the Ryan inquest made 32 recommendations. Broadly speaking, the recommendations sort of looked at a number of themes, tried to address a number of themes. One of those was about identifying and recording risk factors for IPV, and then sharing that information between interdisciplinary teams. So it was really about, gathering information, how to gather information, recognize the risks of IPV, and then make sure those risks, that information is shared. And just as one example, you heard for that the EMS workers who transported Mrs. Ryan to hospital, they relayed that she was fearful for her safety. But it's not clear what happened with that information. And as we know, she was eventually put into a room with her husband, which Dr. Jaffe had seen as that was a possible opportunity for intervention that unfortunately nothing happened with. Another theme that emerged from the recommendations was around training to recognize risk factors related to IPV and IP homicide in aging populations. So various witnesses at the inquest testified that they had not received training in how to identify risk factors of IPV and IP homicide, but also just specifically to aging populations. So there were, for instance, PSWs who testified at the inquest, Mrs. Ryan's care coordinator, the EMS workers, the hospital nursing staff, various frontline service providers who testified they had not received that kind of training. And just as an example, I think one of the things that was highlighted was the identifying the risk factor of declining health and declining mental health, specifically as concerns for aging populations and IPV. Linked to that training recommendation were recommendations for better screening tools to identify IPV risk factors. And then another theme was around advancing collaboration among community partners to address IPV risk factors, and specifically in relation to situation tables. And as I said, the Ryans were identified as requiring intervention. There was a situation table held. They were identified as requiring intervention, but unfortunately, there wasn't enough follow-up with that. So that's the end of our presentation. Just a kind of wrap-up slides. Just wanted to highlight that the number one risk factor identified by the DVDRC over many years for intimate partner homicide is a history of IPV. And the risk factors that we have been developing over many years are constantly evolving, and we're actually currently looking at updating our risk factors and making sure that they're as inclusive as possible and that they're current. We just wanted to highlight some of the unique risk factors for older adults that include declining physical, mental, and cognitive health, memory loss, and social isolation. And just wanted to highlight really the opportunities for prevention, intervention, and referral through information sharing. And also just wanted to give a shout out to the Information and Privacy Commissioner's new plain language tool. And you may be hearing about this tool more later today, but this tool was developed out of a recommendation from the 2022 Renfrew County inquest. That was a very important IPV-related discretionary inquest that examined the deaths of 3 women who were killed on the same day by their former partner. Many of you may be familiar with that inquest, but just wanted to highlight that important tool that's come out of that inquest. Thank you very much. I think, Ran, I'll turn it back to you. Those are our comments.
Excellent. Thank you all for a great overview of this, of homicides. I mean, I was writing down some of the questions, but just from the beginning of the process of how the chief coroner's office works and the risk factors and the process of the DVRCC is so, I think, informative for everyone. And then going through the unfortunate situation that did happen, but we come out with some really good recommendations for us to move forward. And I know we were named in some of those recommendations as an organization, and we've been doing some work, obviously, in trying to increase that training, the collaboration, risk assessments. So when working and trying to break down some of those barriers where people can work better together to support older adults who may be vulnerable. So thank you for that. We have a lot of good questions for you. So the first question came in about what the percentage of homicides that occur in older adults living in long-term care. And I know there is a geriatric death review committee. So Elizabeth, I'm not sure if you can speak to that or if just in general terms, perhaps, and if we're, and the other question was what percentage had a diagnosis of dementia?
Yeah, so this wouldn't specifically fall under the DVDRC. In general, as mentioned, there is actually a geriatric and long-term care a death review committee who does reviews of all homicides in long-term care would be reviewed. So that it would probably be more under the purview of that. I will just note the definition of homicide for the coroner system is a very specific fact-oriented one. So I'll just say when you think about homicides in long-term care, and I'll just talk to as from my experience as a regional supervising coroner, is that you may have two individuals with cognitive impairment. The one pushes another individual, and that individual falls and say breaks their hip, and that individual dies of complications of a hip fracture. Under our classification, that would be called a homicide, and often we do see that in individuals with dementia. So it's depending on what you're referring to as homicide. I don't believe any of our cases had in the domestic violence death review cases were located in long-term care, but you may want to look at the geriatric and long-term care death review committee report, and that should have more specific information around the long-term care homicides.
Great, thanks. And we did put the link in the chat box, and maybe we can just post the website to the Geriatric Death Review Committee website so people can go and look at the different years of reports are listed on the website that people can download. There was a question there, should there be a profile published of those who commit suicide of older women and men? And I'm not sure if that's part of the work that you're doing or is that even available?
So I just want to make sure.
Yeah, so they're asking about if there's a profile of those who commit suicide. Now, I know that you do inquests around suicides. So is that something they talk about with older adults, or age is not a factor in that?
So if suicide was part of a homicide suicide, certain in an intimate partner situation, certainly we do look at risk factors, both of the victim, but also the person that caused the death. So that profile would be developed sort of, as Indra sort of talked about what they looked at in the Ryan and Ryan, and developed those looking at potential risk factors for both individuals involved. So a general quote unquote profile of suicides in older aging adults, whether it be both genders, a little bit beyond our committee, but probably more into the geriatric long-term care.
Okay, thank you. And I know, the definition around intimate and partner violence, but does the death review committee look at perpetrators that may be adult children or different relationships, or is it specifically just IPV?
I can take it, or I'll let Hannah or
Sure, I can go, Liz. You've done a lot of heavy lifting. Brianne, the committee does not look at those sorts of family relationships. If an older child was killed and was a victim, we have sadly a number of cases where a child intervenes trying to protect usually their mother, and is killed or severely injured. So if a child died in that way, we would examine the case, but not if the child was the perpetrator of the violence. Unless I think we had maybe one case, Hannah, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, where there had been sort of very severe brainwashing by the abusive husband of an adult child. And at least we considered, I can't remember what ended up happening with that case if we reviewed it. Hannah's nodding yes.
We did, yeah.
Yeah. So that was a unique set of circumstances.
And that was more the child was groomed as a proxy for the perpetrator.
I think the family violence statistical report that comes out yearly identifies some of those stats as well. I haven't read the last report, but I believe that they do have a section around older adult populations and talking about who committed crimes. So I think that data might be there for those who are asking around that. There was also a question in terms of the recommendations that came out from the report based on the Ryan and Ryan inquest. Somebody was just saying that somehow the recommendations didn't include the sexual assault, domestic violence treatment centers from within hospitals, and that they do play a role. And I know with our work that we've worked with different hospitals, and just making a comment that there has been a lot of changes within hospital policies as a result of the recommendations in this incident, which is a positive move forward, because what we do is want to have change. But I just letting people know that they are a good resource for people to recognize, and they are 24/7, 7 days a week. So I think, we can recognize that. I think recommendations can't list every organization. I think we try our best just to say that as well. But again, just sort of acknowledging the importance of the organization, and they are across hospitals across Ontario. Someone was just saying or just asking. Oh, sorry, I'm just going through because we have lots of them happening. Indira, you mentioned mandatory inquests for children with access orders. Can you elaborate more on this, or does this mean family court access orders?
Liz, I think that this is the same as it is I'm sorry, I don't know the details of that offhand, but I think it's the same as what Liz, for inquests as it is for, am I right about that, Liz, as for coroner's investigations, or is it different?
So it's mandatory to investigate but if there was it is specific having an access order there, not just being under the care or supervision or interaction of Children's Aid.
I can certainly look that up, Brianna, and I can put the section from the Coroner's Act into the chat, because I don't want to make sure I don't misquote it.
Someone just asked a question. I know that there have cited recent inquiries recommendations when opposing bail for high risk IPV individuals, but the courts don't seem to recognize the data or recommendations. Are aging older adult groups lobbying governments to put more pressure on this area? I don't know if you are aware of any of that work that's being done.
The only thing I can comment on is and this is brought up often, is that the recommendations, whether it be from an individual coroner, from an inquest, or the domestic violence, any death review committee, unfortunately are not mandatory. Most recipients do respond. Many create implementation schedules, but we can't compel.
Thank you. And I recognize, and I think that sometimes that's I did have a question myself around the implementation of recommendations, because I think it was maybe Endura that you had mentioned that when the recommendations are out and identified in the report, if there's no organizations, that you hope that they take up the recommendations and take on the action. So our agencies then, or those who identified, have to, or you hope that they give you a written response about what actions that they're taking, or is there any mandatory obligation there, or do you reach out to those organizations, or how does that process work?
There is no mandatory, these are recommendations. The Office of the Chief Coroner cannot compel a response. They cannot compel organizations to implement recommendations. Some of it is sometimes about, public pressure can be a really useful tool, and many community organizations will sort of post recommendations from the Office of the Chief Coroner and communicate about them. And and the recommendations are publicly available, as Hannah said. Both the recommendations and the recommendation responses are publicly available. But the Office of the Chief Coroner doesn't, have a system for auditing all recommendations or anything like that. We do sometimes in inquests, we are able to sometimes look back at previous recommendations and ask witnesses questions about them, about whether they or not they've been implemented. And that can be, a really useful way to look at progress and look at how things have changed as a result of inquest recommendations.
Great, thanks. And then just getting back to the question about
I'll just add
go ahead, Elizabeth. Yes, sorry.
Some of our DVDRC members will look back. Often they have made recommendations in the past, so they will look back at previous recommendations, the same sort of thing, see where things have come, or has there been any changes, and how to build on those recommendations.
Great, thank you. And just getting back also to that advocacy, I know that, there's been a lot of action with the domestic violence coordinating committees to advocate to government to change legislation around identifying domestic or intimate partner violence as an epidemic across Ontario. So there are a lot of organizations and agencies that are doing that, as well as from the older adult population. There was just a meetings of Aging on the Hill that we had just participated as well, looking at the issue around coercive control, because there's a new bill that is out and has received a second reading around coercive control, and we wanted to make sure that older adults were included in that. So we are engaged, and many of our partners across regionally, provincially, and nationally are engaged in these conversations as well. So it's not off. I think it's on people's radar to make sure that we don't miss the importance of including older adults in these conversations that often get missed, which is why we're having this conversation today. The other question I had was, I'm not sure who maybe responded to this. So from what is the time frame from when a homicide occurs, unfortunately, that then goes and gets referred to your review? So to get to that process, like, is it years? Is it months? Is it an immediate that it's going to be referred to you for review, or what's that time frame?
I can speak to that, Fran. We have worked with our Quincy team, which is like our data collection tool that coroners use, and we have now added a domestic violence checkbox that is mandatory for coroners to consider and check off before a case can be closed or finalized. And the notification will directly email me. And so I track the cases in real time. So as soon as a death occurs, I will generally know about it within a couple days. And we track the cases, like Liz said, we can't review them until they're, through their judicial proceedings, if applicable. But we will know about them basically as soon as they occur.
Great, thank you.
Yep, Rhian, I just wanted to note that I put in the chat, I'm sorry, the formatting is a bit hard to read, but to answer the question about the access order. So just to very quickly summarize it for that person who asked, essentially an inquest will be held when certain circumstances outlined under the Child, Youth, and Family Services Act exist. And that's when a court has made an order denying access to the child by a parent of the child, or making the access subject to supervision. And then anyway, it's kind of pretty detailed, but it's all laid out then. It's certain circumstances relating to an access order where there is one and then it's varied and then a child dies as a result. So I just wanted to make sure that we close that off.
Great, thank you. I just have one last question because we're just sort of wrapping up. So I know that I think it was Elizabeth had identified sort of where you get your information from when you're doing the review of the situation. So how do you identify, like if you go through police reports and, you know, text messaging, like do you need a warrant or how do you access that information? And then how do you identify different points of who could have been involved? Do you go outside the box and say someone bringing in different witnesses, or is it kind of a clear-cut process?
Maybe I'll take it. So
yeah, and it's different, just to be clear, it's different for inquests than for the DVDRC.
Okay.
Yeah,
so let's go to the inquest part.
Well, Liz, why don't you go first with the DVDRC part?
Yeah, so the Coroner's Act actually gives coroners pretty broad powers under what we call an authority to seize. And often that is where even the initial coroner will often seize records. So as a coroner, if I want to review medical records of an individual, and it has to be of a deceased individual. So say there was a homicide, I could not go and look, I couldn't request the medical records or psychiatric records of the perpetrator, the living I have no jurisdiction. In the case if it was a homicide suicide, because both are deceased, I could obtain the records there. So, the police briefs, police do assist us in our investigations. They may have a parallel justice system investigation going on. So much of our information for DVDRC comes from the briefs from police. I'm going to say they're more robust if it is a homicide as opposed to a homicide suicide situation. And those we tend to review quicker because obviously the perpetrator is no longer living and there's no justice system proceedings. So yeah, we have pretty broad search and seizure. If in the initial brief the member identifies, hey, maybe there's some medical records or counseling records, they can ask and we can try to obtain them. But as mentioned, we do not go back and interview people, things like things like that. So it is done sort of in a retrospective way, which is a bit different from inquest where they do call witnesses and can question.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for such an informative launching of our conference today, and for taking the time to share your knowledge and help out with the chat, answering people's questions that has come up. I really appreciate your time and expertise with us today. If you're able to stay on for the duration, that would be great. I understand if you're not able to, but thank you again. And we look forward to further conversations and collaboration with you and implementing some of the recommendations that have come forward from that Ryan and Ryan inquiry. And we've been doing so. And part of that information sharing that you talked about, we will be having a speaker on that. We'll be talking about risk assessment next, which was also identified. So we're kind of having a flow to this conferences and the themes that have arisen and the recommendations to making sure that people are equipped so they know that they can share information when there is a high risk situation. So we can alleviate these homicides from happening. So thank you again. And I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for the invite.
Thank you.
We're hoping to put ourselves out of business.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.